Good evening, everyone. I am your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are a returning listener and subscriber, so glad to have you back. If you're new to the channel, welcome. Dig what you see. Please hit like and subscribe. It's an extremely passive gesture that goes a long way. Let's bring in everybody, because I know some of you are playing hooky from the vice presidential debate, and I appreciate you guys for hanging out with us tonight. Coming in live all the way from Hurricane Central is my homie, my dog, my man, the man of the Mad Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings to Jason Miles.
How are you?
Well, all right.
Nice and hurricane free. How hard did it hit your neighborhood?
We were unscathed.
So when you flaked on us on the champagne room, it was just you flaking?
I was worried.
She is the faceless voice of reason on the show. She put this show together. Please welcome M2 Son.
Hello. So
How are you?
good to be here tonight with you two fellas.
I'm really excited about this show. This was actually a really cool book. And it's one of those things that not a lot of people talk about.
That's right.
So I'm excited for that. And I totally forgot today was the vice presidential debate.
I didn't realize that either.
I didn't know or care. And then our good friend Terebi was like, "Are you watching the debate tonight?" I was like, "No." No. I didn't watch the presidential one. You think I'm going to watch these two? Go at it. Come on, man. Are you watching it on like one little phone, Pascal? Keeping an eye on.
No, I watched the presidential, though. I'm not watching the vice president.
What do you have against JD Vance?
I think he wears makeup.
Like just that?
Wow.
Like that's all you have against it?
No, I
It's your
think he's just
objection.
especially one of those guys who wears makeup, but he persecutes gay people.
You say you don't trust a man that wears makeup and persecutes gay people?
No, he said he strikes me as one of those guys.
I mean, that's a fair assessment, I guess. But let's talk about what we're going to talk about. In her book, We Are Not Yet Able to Live in the Sky, The Seductive Promise of Microfinance, Mara Kardas-Nelson offers a deep critical examination of microfinance and its limitations. For decades, microfinance has been heralded as a transformative solution for global poverty, lauded for its ability to empower the poor by offering small loans to entrepreneurs in marginalized communities. Yet, as Kardas-Nelson argues, I hope I'm saying her name right. Kardas? We didn't even ask her before the show.
No, we didn't ask her.
Shit.
She'll correct us.
Okay. As our guest argues, the idealistic narrative that surrounds microfinance is not only misleading, but also has served to perpetuate neoliberal economic frameworks that prioritize market solutions over structural changes. In a world increasingly governed by capitalist logics, microfinance has been presented as a panacea to systemic poverty. But as our guest writes, microfinance is not a replacement for equitable economic policy or the redistribution of wealth. It is an individualized and thus limited solution to a collective problem. By exploring the experiences of those directly affected, our guest weaves together personal narratives, historical context, and a powerful critique of how microfinance often fails to address the root causes of poverty, instead reinforcing cycles of debt and dependency. Throughout the book, the central tension that emerges is the clash between the seductive simplicity of microfinance and the complex realities of the economic structures it claims to address. Kardas-Nelson invites readers to critically rethink the role of microfinance in development, arguing that its promises, while often framed as radical and revolutionary, ultimately serve the interest of global capital rather than those of the impoverished communities it purports to serve. She poignantly observes the allure of microfinance lies in its promise of individual success. But what we need is collective liberation. This book pushes us to re examine not only the promises of microfinance, but also the broader development frameworks that continue to prioritize market based solutions over systemic reforms. As we delve into the core arguments of this work, our discussion will focus on how microfinance interests with gender, global capitalism, and the politics of aid, and what alternatives exist for truly emancipatory development practices. Please welcome our guests coming all the way live from the East Coast. Ah, can you bring her in? I'm having trouble bringing people in. Mara Kardas-Nelson. There you go.
Hey, you pronounced it correctly. It's Kardas-Nelson. You got it.
Yes.
I should have helped you with that one. It's not phonetic. So I appreciate
I didn't know if it was like a special pronoun. No, it's Kadas. The R is silent. It's like fuck.
Oh,
But
I
it
think
was.
I lost you all.
Uh-oh. I'm here. Can you hear me? Hello, hello. We can hear
There
you
we go.
just we
Yeah,
can hear
yeah.
you just fine the whole time.
Okay, great.
In your first chapter, you discuss the early rise of microfinance and the ways in which it was marketed as a magic bullet for poverty alleviation. Could you please expand on how this narrative was constructed and why it became so widely accepted? What were the underlying neoliberal ideologies that allowed this narrative to thrive? I believe you write microfinance was sold as a way to lift individuals out of poverty, but it did so by positioning the poor as entrepreneurs in a system that required their participation in the market rather than challenging the structures that created their poverty.
That's right. So most people, and I've seen this in the chat, if they've heard of microfinance, they've heard of someone named Muhammad Yunus, who happens to be the current interim leader of Bangladesh. So Muhammad Yunus is a Bangladeshi economist, and he did his PhD here in the U.S. And when he returned to Bangladesh, he became increasingly known for pitching this idea that a small loan given to a poor person, and particularly a poor woman, could be used by that woman to start a business, and then the profits from that business would be used to lift her out of poverty. So it was promised as this kind of very simple, very elegant solution to poverty, in which a loan would allow a person to lift themselves up by the bootstraps, and take care of their own problems, right? Take care of their family, take care of the myriad problems they were facing in their lives as poor people. And so I go in the book in some detail about the fact that this actually wasn't Muhammad Yunus alone who was pitching this idea. There were a lot of other people at the same time who were pitching that or a similar idea. And in fact, there's a very long history of saving and lending groups that we see in places like Sierra Leone, where half of the book takes place, that have been going back for centuries. So just to say, first and foremost, that this is often pitched as Muhammad Yunus's idea, but it is a much more complicated reality there. But as you pointed out, it really kind of took off in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. So I was studying international relations in the mid 2000s, and every course that I took, whether it was political science or economics, had microfinance in there as this is the solution to poverty, right? It was pitched by the UN. It's been pitched and supported by every US president from Reagan onwards. And in part because of this simplicity, this notion that, wow, this very complicated problem, intractable poverty, global inequality, can be fixed through a loan, right? And there was kind of two sides of that was so appealing. One was the fact that it was so simplistic, and the other that it's a loan, that you get the money back, right? That it's not charity, it's not a grant, that this is a way for kind of people to become self-reliant and to become economically responsible and to be involved in the market. And so this became really popular because it appealed to all sorts of different types of people. So it appealed on what we kind of might consider the progressive side of the political spectrum. It had appeal to global feminists, for example. So the idea that these loans would be given to women was really was really appealing to global feminists who had been concerned about women being left out of other international development programs, and the idea that women were involved in small-scale informal economies that were often unseen by the World Bank, the UN, and others, right? So this was kind of tapped into that notion of a more grassroots feminist economy. And then on what we would consider the conservative right, it really tapped into this notion of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, right? So we don't need large programs, we don't need government programs, we don't need collective action. Instead, a loan will allow an individual to take care of themselves. And so there was this kind of fantastic convergence of the two on the political left and the political right, where you saw, independence leaders in places like Africa that were coming out of a long period of colonialism who said, yeah, let us take care of our own destiny, let our citizens take care of our own destiny, and this is one way to do it. And that converged with those like Reagan, who were saying, let's unleash the private sector, the forces of the market, to allow people to take care of themselves. And so that kind of converged. There was this kind of fantastic meddling of those two political ideologies that converged to allow microfinance to become as successful as it was. And Muhammad Yunus famously won the Nobel Peace Prize for coming up with this idea of microfinance and really advocating for it in 2006. And so that was kind of the heyday of microfinance. And so it was this really interesting blend, and I spent a lot of time researching that blend because it's pretty unique to see, such a wide spectrum of people agree that this one idea is the answer. But a major core of that also was the premise that this wasn't going to be a program that was going to be that expensive, or that was going to have to be included in or promoted, supported in perpetuity, right? Because these were loans, again, not charity, not grants, not state-supported programs. You could kind of, it could eventually pay for itself. And so that was really appealing as well, just from a kind of financial point of view.
Pascal, I'm sure there's something you want to follow up.
Yeah, one of the things that I find interesting about this whole subject matter is how it's the perfect confluence of the pinnacle of neoliberal financialization with goodwill, charity rhetoric, and gender kind of girl power, discourse. Can you talk about how the powers that be kind of melded, how this was the perfect marketing ploy of all of these really, really noxious kind of ideas that come together to create what I would consider a financial hustle for third people in the global South?
Totally. So again, it was, as you say, it was this kind of mix of like girl power and financialization of poverty, right? And the two together, and the notion that, and we still see this in newer iterations of microfinance today, which I'm happy to talk about. Microfinance, even though we don't hear about it necessarily as much on a day-to-day basis in the way that I did when I was studying international relations in the mid-2000s, it's still very present in millions of people's lives. But it's the notion that in order for poor people to be like the rest of us, right, which supposedly is what we want all poor people to be, they have to have access to financial tools, right? And that is that's framed as an emancipatory service, right?
Mhm.
Giving someone financial tools that you or I have, as people here in the U.S., that's considered that was kind of pitched as a sort of emancipation. So let poor people free themselves, kind of unshackle themselves. Let women unshackle themselves from traditional notions of what they should be, from the jobs that they should have. And so it tapped in, as you say, it tapped into all sorts of different ideas of what is good, right? So whether that's allowing women to determine their own destinies, or allowing the market to be unleashed in order for those destinies to be fulfilled. And so it was this thing that had something for everyone. And, when I talk to people who supported microfinance, decades later, they say, oh, I guess now that I think about it, of course, if you're giving a loan to someone, you're also offering them debt, right? The flip side of a loan is debt. But it was never framed that way, right? We never talked about micro debt. It was always microfinance, and always in this very emancipatory language. And it was really hard for detractors. There were detractors from the early days of microfinance who said, hang on a minute, let's talk a little bit about the details of these loans and just about the premise of whether lending in and of itself is really an anti-poverty program, or if it is rather a financial program, as you say. But even those detractors from the early days, it was pretty easy to kind of shoo that aside pretty quickly when the language was so emancipatory, right? When there's so much kind of excitement, and when everyone's on board, especially in a really fractious society like we have in the US, it was hard to say to kind of even bring up any criticism, even if that criticism was asking about, is this really a premise that we should be supporting? And it's important to note that because there was so little criticism, because that criticism was quieted by this language of emancipation for so long, a lot of the details of the loans didn't come to light or become kind of more public knowledge until decades after microfinance became popular. So the loans that I found in Sierra Leone, West Africa, where half of the book takes place, the women are paying around 50-60% interest. And that's actually considered very, very low for microfinance. But those sort of rates weren't talked about as much in the early days, or if they were, it was kind of oh, well, it's unfortunate that these rates need to be so high, but it's worth it for the price of financial emancipation, for poverty alleviation, right? And so it was always, when you have that language, that's positivist language, it made it really, really hard to have more nuanced conversations.
I know we're about 20 minutes in or so to the conversation, but can we get a definition on exactly what microfinance is?
It's a really good question. So the easiest definition is small loans given to poor people with the idea that they will use those loans to start businesses and launch themselves out of poverty. Right. So a loan as kind of an anti-poverty solution, with the idea that that loan is used to invest in a business, and then profits are used to fund everything that a poor person might need, whether it's education, housing, water, etc. The reason I say that's kind of the easy definition is, in fact, it's much more complicated at this point, where there's around 200 million people who take out microfinance loans internationally. There isn't a single definition. And so everyone in Sierra Leone, I walked into multiple offices, all of whom said they were doing microfinance loans, but the details of what those loans looked like varied greatly. So it could be anywhere from a loan that was specifically for an agricultural product, or to a loan that was for an SUV. And they both called it microfinance. So essentially now, microfinance in poorer countries means a loan to a poor person. There isn't a very kind of stringent definition, but the way we think about it often in our kind of more Western imagination is an anti-poverty loan specifically given for business, with the idea that that loan will lift people out of poverty. And a lot of studies have shown that actually a lot of the loans aren't invested in business, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One of that is that the conditions don't actually allow for that to happen. When you're paying such high interest rates, it's really, really hard to invest in a successful business. And the loans are instead used for kind of day-to-day costs, or for, paying off another debt, another microfinance debt. A lot of loans are used to pay off another debt, and they start to look a lot more like payday loans than anti-poverty loans.
And even the payday loan industry, I mean, let's talk domestically for a little bit, is pretty underregulated, to put it extremely mildly. Maybe I'm being a little too generous with it. I think because everything we're talking about here kind of lives in poverty, and until you actually have to deal with it, because I'm not going to lie, I found myself in a desperate situation where an opportunity came my way, and the only thing I could do was take out a payday loan for my business, right? But to your point, the return you have to have business wise, if one little thing goes wrong, and that's ultimately what happened, we we used it for a tour. We were promised so much money each night. We didn't get it. So you're in default before you know it. And you can't get out of these things. They're the interest you pay is pretty astronomical.
Yeah.
But it feels like the feeling around it is, well, don't take it out if you can't pay it back. And it's like, oh no, I've paid it back 5 times.
Totally.
That's not the point. The point is that, I don't have family that can just drop me a few grand for me to realize my dreams. Right? Not
Yeah.
everybody has that.
I've heard, I hear that a lot when I talk to people about microfinance, even now when I describe the conditions. The most expensive loan that I found was 250% annual interest.
Mm.
And even when I describe those conditions, people will say, oh, well, if those, people are rational economic actors, if those conditions don't work for them, they can just decide not to take out the loan. But of course, these loans are specifically pitched to poor people. And we're talking about whether that's here in the US, payday lending, or in Sierra Leone. They're not the poorest people in Sierra Leone, but this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And so the women that I met were taking out the loans because they felt like they had no other choice, right? There was no other way to access money. They weren't well connected. To your point, they didn't have connections to, other people in the community who had money. And so this was the way that they got cash. That's how they understood these loans. These loans were not understood by these women as a way to build business. They learned how to use that language, that narrative of business in order to get the loans, but they really understood the loans as a way to kind of get by, right? And that was happening at the same time that things in Sierra Leone were getting more and more expensive. And again, there's a parallel here to the US. People take out payday loans for things like healthcare, for housing, in addition to small businesses, as you mentioned. And it's the same thing in Sierra Leone. The women that I met were taking out the loans to pay for their children's school fees, to pay for transportation as the cost of gas went up. And so this notion of, oh, well, people are just rational economic actors, they can decide whether or not to enter the market, right? That's like the very kind of basic premise of a market-based society. These women had no other choice. And so they were aware of the risks they were taking, which included potentially going to the police or jail if they didn't pay back the loans. But they really felt like, I live in a society in which none of my services are paid for by the government or offered by the government. This is the way that I need to get by. And I think there's certainly a very strong parallel, and a lot of people have argued this, between microfinance and payday lending, especially when it comes to regulation, as you noted. And there's a very, very limited regulation of microfinance none at an international level. And at a national level, it's kind of up to governments to do it on their own. And as you can imagine, in a place like Sierra Leone that is overwhelmed, it's very difficult for the Sierra Leonean government to suddenly come up with a regulatory body for microfinance, right? When they're suddenly flooded with new microfinance companies. And one of the people that I met with there, who works for the Central Bank of Sierra Leone, I asked him, why don't you regulate microfinance companies? Why don't you at least monitor interest rates? And he said, oh, we've been told by the IMF that we need to have a deregulated financial market here in order to. And he said this multiple times because I wanted to make sure that I understood him correctly and that I understood what he was saying. And he said, yeah, his understanding was we are not able to regulate interest rates, including of microfinance loans, because the IMF has told us that we need to have a deregulated financial economy here in Sierra Leone. So I think the other thing that's underlying the question that you asked is this notion of difference, right? The notion that poor people just kind of can survive on higher price loans, right? It's just kind of, it is what it is. And that's
you knew what you were getting into.
You knew what you were getting into. Yeah, exactly. Like, at least you have an option that's better than nothing. And I think what I found throughout reporting this book, and also just through work on international development more generally, is we really expect poor people, whether they're poor people here in the US or poor people internationally, to live differently than the rest of us do, right? And Muhammad Yunus really framed this in a positive way. Like he framed, the idea that poor people were almost like magical in their ability to take a loan and make a business, right? This kind of like, again, this emancipatory language, this notion of, wow, you can give a woman a high price loan and still she can create a business and still lift herself out of poverty, this kind of like fairy tale notion, right? And so that's a really positive framing, but it's still seeing women, poor people, poor women as different than the rest of us, right? It's assuming that they don't need the same things that the rest of us need, that they don't need reasonably priced credit, that they don't need functioning state systems. And I think it's throughout the process of researching and writing the book, the thing that really came out was the notion of, a positive difference is still a difference. We're still viewing poor people as different than the rest of us. And so we say, oh, we want to offer them the same financial products that the rest of us do. That was the framing, right? If they have the same financial products that we do, then they'll be able to thrive like we do. Except the caveat there is that those financial products were actually very different than the products that other people have access to in terms of rates and other conditions. So I think this notion of like, oh, well, it is what it is, and at least it's something, really underlies both the payday loan and payday lending industry here and microfinance internationally.
Well, I think it's even worse than it's something. It's like, well, these people just aren't smart,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's all, to me. That's all. I don't know if you guys feel the same way. It always feels like, well, you could read the fine print. You knew what you were doing. No one was trying to pull the wool over your eyes. It's all right there. It's like, but not everybody has the same opportunities. And when you're already operating kind of right above homelessness constantly, a bad day, a downsizing of a job, hours cut from a job, people that are working within the gig economy, as that ebbs and flows, so does people's ability to pay these loans back, because again, the interest rates are so astronomical. It may make sense on some level to take that money out initially, right? Like, I'm going to do this because you talk about this in your book. These women are starting businesses from the Sierra Leone context. It's when we say start a business, sometimes the businesses they're starting they're so small. Like, I'm just going to get some stuff from over here and sell it on this side of the street because there's no one selling fruit on this side of the street. So I just need money to buy fruit. It's I feel like for me, reading this kind of laid bare the fact that we really hate any sort of state-sponsored social services.
That's what I was going to.
Oh, go ahead, Pascal. Go ahead. You can elaborate with bigger words.
One of the things I was going to say is that, did you notice how much these processes are contingent on an inability of the state to provide services for the citizenry? Like, the lack of the availability of a healthy state government is part of the mechanism that allows these microfinancing schemes to flourish. And I think that one of the things that we notice is that, for example, when you said that the IMF was demanding that the central banks of the African countries where microfinancing were existing, state deregulated, illustrates how neoliberal capitalism functions in an order where state functionality is neutralized almost intentionally.
Yeah. So one of the things I looked at was actually the history of NGOs. And so now we think of NGOs as like just a thing that exists in the world, right? If you think about international aid, international development, international health work, you think, oh, there's like an NGO in wherever that works on that, right? An NGO in Kenya, an NGO in India that works on health issues, for example, or economic issues. And we just think of those as kind of baked into the world as it exists. But NGOs are actually a really new phenomenon, particularly particularly in international development. And so I looked at how NGOs, nonprofits, and non-governmental organizations really started to have a larger and larger footprint during structural adjustment programs. And so this was a period in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, in which the IMF and the World Bank were essentially saying to governments, you need to cut public funding and you need to liberalize your economy, so open your economy to imports, deregulate your financial sector. And the result of structural adjustment programs, as a lot of other people have written about, was devastating for many countries, and particularly for public services in those countries. And so, as healthcare became privatized and became smaller, as education became privatized and there was a smaller footprint by the state, NGOs really were there to kind of fill the gaps, right? And those NGOs are just to be really clear, are private organizations and often funded in part by Western governments. And so, I mean, that sounds kind of conspiratorial, and I don't mean it to be that. Really, there is that very well documented, that pattern, that as poorer country governments were being encouraged or forced to take these programs, take these steps in order to reduce the size of the state programs and increase the size of private actors, that NGOs were really there to fill the gaps. And this happened at the exact same time that microfinance started to rise. So the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, this proliferation of NGOs was really mapped onto the proliferation of microfinance, right? So both the idea of, okay, well, the state has gotten smaller or has been forced to get smaller. And so there'll be private organizations and private finance there to fill the gaps. I think that's a really important thing to understand when we talk about microfinance. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because the history of microfinance, which really, as I said, is from 1970 till today, maps on almost perfectly to the history of international aid. Right. So understanding why microfinance became as popular as it did, why it was supported by progressives and conservatives at the same time, and also how it fit this kind of worldview of, okay, the state is going to get smaller and these private organizations, private finance is going to fill that void. And so the book is very much about microfinance, but really traces the history of microfinance along that history of international aid, and kind of unpacking these things that we think are just normal now, right? That, oh, of course, if you were going to give or support, let's say, water access in Kenya, you're going to do it through an NGO. But that's actually a really new phenomenon. That's within people's lifetimes, right? That's been true. And so I think that's a really important understanding, history to unpack, and understanding that, in addition to understanding the way that those policies work now. But I think more kind of, I really wanted to understand, like, how did we get here, right? How did we get to the point where the women in Sierra Leone, the only way that they understand to be able to access cash is through microfinance, and they need that cash to pay for private services, private healthcare, private education, private water, etc.
Wow, the private water is the super scary part. Now, this was never what you set out to do with your career. You kind of discovered this and said, I'm going to make a left turn in life and and start researching this. What was it that you saw that made you kind of, make that phone call home and say, I think I'm not going to be part of the system?
Yeah. So I've always had one foot in journalism and one foot in global, what we call global health, but healthcare internationally. And so, I mean, because I've always worked in journalism too, it's meant that I have like quite a kind of critical approach to a lot of the global health work that I've done, which at times I think has made me very bad at working in global health, but it's there, right? Once you ask questions, once you learn that that's a way to see the world, it's pretty hard to turn that off. That being said, I came across this story in particular when I was working in global health. So I was living in Sierra Leone after Ebola. So the country was emerging from the largest Ebola outbreak in world history. And I was having lunch with a colleague who mentioned that in her previous job, she had worked for a legal aid organization. and that legal aid organization helped women who were dealing with the legal system, including those who were dealing with criminalized debt, including microfinance debtors. So she had met microfinance debtors who had been taken to the police and to jail because they were behind on paying $30, $60, $100 loans. And so I was like, oh my God, like, how is that possible? First of all, that people are going to jail for such small amount of money, but also like, what happened to microfinance, right? We had heard about it so much here in the US and North America, and then it kind of disappeared. And yet it was still clearly very present in places like Sierra Leone and poor countries where it was promised to emancipate poor people. And so I wanted to, I kind of couldn't shake it, right? I had this question always of like, what is that? Like, we finished our lunch and we went back to work, but years later, I still was kind of asking like, what's up with that, basically. And so I went back a couple of years later and started to report and just started to talk to as many people as I could, women in markets who were selling, as you said, small things like flip-flops and fruit. And I just asked them, like, do you take out a microfinance loan? What are the conditions for those loans? Is it working for you? Do you know anyone who's gone to jail? Just to kind of get a sense of the sector. And it was the markets in Sierra Leone were totally blanketed with microfinance loans. And I had lived there for 3 years as a privileged person working for an international organization and had no idea, right? I was completely blind to this.
Is English the international? Is that the language there?
Technically, yeah, English is the official state language or national language of Sierra Leone. Creole is the language that most people speak, which is a mix of English and African languages. So everything is like written in English, but spoken in Creole. So I learned Creole during my time.
Ask, did you learn the language in
I
doing
did.
your?
Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
you were doing some real deal interviewing then.
Yes. I mean, I spent a lot of time literally just sitting in the corners of markets and then corners of people's homes in order to kind of understand how this is working. Because it's not, when this, you've had to deal with high price debt. It's not like there's always these moments of drama, right? Sometimes there are these very dramatic moments, but a lot of time it's kind of like low key stress that is there with you, that you're having to deal with. And I wanted to capture that, right? I didn't just want these dramatic moments of either success that we would hear about when we talk about the positive sides of microfinance, or of these really horribly negative things. Like, I wanted to understand a lot more how this debt was baked into someone's day-to-day life, how it affected their relationships, their friendships, their businesses, how it affected the way they understood themselves, even like their self-esteem. And so that took a lot of just like sitting and listening to people.
Could you speak to some of those real world examples that you encountered that kind of illustrate this dark side of microfinance? I think you did such a good job of of having these conversations to the point where, when I'm reading the book, and I do have to say, and we were saying this before you came on, you're a good writer. And for some reason, when you open the book, I feel like you're transported to Sierra Leone. So can you tell us a little bit about the women, because it's mostly women that you spoke with and their families?
Yeah. So I follow two groups of women, one in Freetown, which is the capital of Sierra Leone, and one in Kono, which is in the eastern part of the country. And if you watched Blood Diamond, that film about the Sierra Leonean Civil War with Leonardo DiCaprio, in which he has a terrible South African accent, that takes place in part in Kono, in the eastern part of the country. So it's known for its diamonds. So if you know anything about Sierra Leone,
you spoke about that in this way that, for me, and this is just in the beginning of the book, just to let you guys know, this isn't like 180 pages in. She hits you right in the chest when you talk about this couple where the husband works at this kind of like a dead mine. That sounded like heartbreaking.
Yeah. So I mean, that's like a whole nother story, and there's a lot of people who have written on mining in Sierra Leone. So if people are interested in that, there's like a wealth of information to out there. But yeah, so in Kono, which has been kind of the heartland of diamond mining in Sierra Leone, there aren't actually that many diamonds anymore, right? So it's still the major industry of Kono, and it's them millions of dollars of diamonds have been extracted from Kono, but it remains an incredibly poor area, and yet there's still this kind of promise of diamonds that might be there. In a way, it kind of parallels the promise of microfinance, right? Like maybe you'll make it as a businesswoman, maybe you won't. And it's the same thing for what we call artisanal miners. Which sounds super fancy, and it means informal miners who are basically like freelancers working for themselves, working in pits and hoping for a diamond. And so one of the women that I follow in the book, her husband is an artisanal miner, and she talks about how he's been doing this for decades, and he's still waiting for his big diamond, and his body has kind of been broken down in the meantime. And so as a result of that, she's the one who needs to figure out how to make ends meet, right? And so we start with her, and she receives a call from a friend of hers who is in the police station, and she realizes that she's in the police station for microfinance debt. And so I follow these two groups of women, and several of those at different periods throughout their time taking out microfinance loans have these interactions with the legal system. And some of them are kind of what you might describe as little blips. They're, the police knock on their door, or they're taken to the police station, and then they can kind of massage a way out. They can call a friend or their boyfriend to pay off the debt. But for those who don't have those sort of social connections or are too embarrassed to use them, they do end up in police stations for a longer period of time or in jail. So one of the women that I met spent about 1.5 years in jail.
Wow.
For finance debt. Even though she was never actually found guilty, she was just kept there until she could have a hearing with a judge. And she was, I got to meet her. I went to the place that she lives now, and she's out of jail, but she is so ashamed of that interaction with the legal system, so embarrassed that she refuses to go back to live with her family. And so now she lives in this very small mining town in another part of Kono, doing artisanal mining to get by. And so you see the way these informal economies kind of interact with one another. But I was really taken by how shame was often the most lasting impact for these women. So, we think of, again, these dramatic ruptures, like the fact that she went to jail for 1.5 years, or being yelled at by the police in front of your house. And those were the most dramatic, kind of obvious negative consequences of the debt. But what I was really struck by was even the women who on paper maybe did okay or had a successful business or paid off their loan, the moments when they were behind on their debt, or their neighbors and friends knew that they were behind on their debt because they were being yelled at by officers from the microfinance bank, those really stayed with them. They felt really embarrassed and ashamed for not being able to succeed. And I think what's important to think about there is, we talked about the kind of emancipatory promise of microfinance, and that even though the women that I met in Sierra Leone knew that that was kind of a false promise, like how do you make a $30 loan into a successful business with 50% interest? Like they knew that that was crazy. And yet they still felt somehow that they had failed, because it was kind of this like international expectation that they've been offered an anti-poverty program. Like, why didn't they make it? And I was really struck by that, right? And that's something that I kind of slowly saw over time. It's not something you obviously see when you would meet a person, but I saw the way it kind of seeped into their psyche and their relationships with their friends and their family.
Is microfinance the libertarian wet dream?
I certainly think that there's an argument to be made for that. And I think that from the perspective of the promise that a market-based private solution would free millions of people from poverty, and then the rest of us and the state would have its hands cleaned? Yes, right? I mean, that is the promise, right? The promise that you don't need a state solution, you don't need a collective solution, that this is an individual, private solution to poverty. I think what's really microfinance continues to be so, it continues to have like a life in the world, in part because people still believe in it, even people who really are, who are trying to do good. Someone living in California who wants to help someone in Mexico, right? They support a microfinance organization, and that's still happening. It's not this kind of, oh, the dream is dead, we've moved on. This is still a very present system, and one that persists in part because the promise is so seductive.
Tucson, did you want to add something?
I think it's interesting. One of the reasons why I was interested in your work and wanted you to come on the show was because just a few years ago, I was offered a microloan.
Oh, interesting.
I was starting a business, and I was encouraged to, I don't know, I guess, start a partnership with Kiva.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to be one of the Kiva loanees, I
Yeah,
guess
yeah.
you would say. I was in a business incubator before then. I had made it to their accelerator program. My business was fast-tracked for startup. And then I was encouraged to go to Kiva. And just before my photo shoot for their website, they pulled my loan.
Mm.
I guess they figured I would end up using the profit for rent.
They were on you.
I was never given a clear answer. It's so interesting how my loan was pulled in the United States, but these women were given their loans and they were allowed to get into that level of debt. And shame and embarrassment play an interesting part in your book. But also, I'm just past the part in your book where you talk about the 80 or possibly 200 suicides due to this debt. I cannot imagine being on the hook for that kind of money, where I would think to drink my Monsanto pesticide and just,
I mean, it's a frightening reality, and do you think that people look at debt like this a little different parts of the world? I mean, you just got to spend, like you said, 3 years in Sierra Leone. It sounds like people look at failing to pay back this debt less as a shoulder shrug, like that. I guess I can't, get that high interest rate credit card now, and more of a I'm a social failure.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. So yes, I think that debt functions differently in different places, and shame also functions differently in different places. And I think part of the problem with microfinance is that it was pitched as a kind of one and done, one all solution that would work whether you were supporting or lending to a poor person in Bangladesh, a poor person in Mexico, a poor person in Sierra Leone, right? The notion that all poor people are somehow the same, and that you can have one program that would work in all of these different places in the same way was part of what was so exciting about it, particularly for Western funders. This notion of, oh my gosh, we can like fund one program, USAID can fund one program and support millions, hundreds of millions of people. But that completely negates the different realities that exist for these different people, right? Poor people are not all the same, just as rich people are not all the same, just as you and I are not the same, right? Even though we live in the same country, no one would say, oh, all Americans are the same, right? We have an understanding of nuance in a way that we don't necessarily offer the same understanding of nuance for people living internationally, and particularly poor people, right? And so I think that was a huge part of the problem, was assuming that if a program worked in one place, that it would work everywhere else. And I think it's really important to note that Muhammad Yunus, he pitched the program for Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh has a history of very high-priced money lenders, and they have a history of women not being able to access any sort of loan at all, right? That is the history that he was building off of. But then he pitched this as a global solution, even though it actually was born out of a very specific context. And you see this across all sorts of international development, nonprofit, the sort of notion of needing to be at scale, right? The notion that if it doesn't work everywhere, it doesn't work anywhere. This is very, I mean, I saw it in my global health work. Even organizations that I really supported and loved would say, oh, well, this thing worked well here in Sierra Leone, so we have to export it to Ethiopia. I mean, those are drastically different places, right? And so I think that was and remains a huge issue in international development, is the simplicity with which we understand really complicated problems, and the assumption that that all poor people are the same, and that they need the same things, and that their cultural and historical and other context is the same. One thing about that Kiva program that I think is really interesting is, so the Kiva US program has promised 0% interest loans, which begs the question, if you can do 0% loans here in the US, why can't you do that internationally, right? And so why are we expecting different conditions for different people, and why are we giving, in fact, better conditions to relatively wealthy people and worse conditions to relatively poor people internationally? And Kiva's answer is, well, we work through other microfinance organizations. We don't set the conditions. They kind of say, you know, they use the Facebook answer of, we're a platform, so we can't really tell microlenders what to do. But if we assume that that's good enough for Americans, why isn't that good enough for everyone else?
That's a great point.
Take that. Before you go, I want to say thank you again for taking the time to talk with us. I know it's late where you are. I do want to ask you one more long 15-part question before you go.
Let's do it.
Also, I want to remind everyone, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's links in the description. It's the first line in the description, which is a link to the book. It's always the first line. In your chapter 4, Microfinance and Politics of Aid, in this chapter, you discuss the ways in which microfinance has been integrated into the broader politics of international aid. To what extent does microfinance allow governments and international organizations to avoid addressing deeper economic inequalities, quote, by focusing on individual entrepreneurialism through microfinance, international aid policies sidestep the need for structural reforms that would address the broader economic injustices that perpetuate poverty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really, because it was microfinance, this idea that small loans would take care of poverty, it did two things at once. So one, on a very practical level, it actually took money away from other programs that might be doing other things. So I traced in the book organizations, nonprofit organizations that had offered a myriad of services. So things like healthcare alongside education, alongside business training, and replaced it with microfinance, right? So having kind of a package of services. And as I noted before, that package of services often replacing government services, or because there was a dearth of government services. But regardless, a package of services, and then pivoting to only microfinance. And because the argument was, oh, if microfinance works as an anti-poverty solution, why do we need that more robust package of services, right? We just allow poor people to take care of themselves. But I saw this in many organizations in the early 1990s, in particular, this very hard pivot. And so, on a very practical level, it was it meant money and focus on microfinance meant less money and focus on other kind of more comprehensive solutions. But I think at a larger narrative level, the focus on microfinance really detracts from and distracts from a focus on structural drivers of poverty and structural solutions to poverty. So when we're all kind of having this kumbaya moment that all we need to do is to give a loan and we save a life and that's it, then there's no need to look at historical context. There's no need to look at the structural conditions of poverty. And there's no need to talk about the much harder structural solutions to poverty, right? It really offers a narrative distraction from much much harder conversations. And I think there's a risk of that being true to a certain extent with even things like universal basic income, right? Which again, we're seeing a convergence of people on the left and the right really supporting this idea of universal basic income, or internationally, it's sometimes called basic cash grants or unconditional cash transfers, but the idea to give cash to poor people to let them do what they want with it. There's a lot of momentum around that. And I think that is exciting in so much as it's not asking those poor people to give the money back, to pay the money back, right? So that's a step in the right direction. But it still offers that narrative simplicity of, oh, if we just give people money, then that's it, right? Then everything will kind of be fixed. And what if you give people money and yet services continue to be privatized, so they need more and more money to pay for those basic services, right? And actually, libertarians who support universal basic income see that as the model that they're pushing for. They say, yes, everyone will become kind of their own free market actor. Everything will be privatized, but people will have money and they'll get to do what they want with that money. And the studies that have been done on universal basic income or affiliated programs have said this only works in as much as there are accessible services that are not just private, right? And so there was one study in Stockton, California, actually, that happened during COVID, and that had very positive impacts. But there was a big caveat, which was during COVID, everything got more expensive. And so people had money from this universal basic income, but they had to spend more and more money just to stay afloat, right? And so I think that it's the same sort of example of not addressing the basic structural underpinnings of poverty and instead kind of throwing money at it, literally throwing money at it and hoping that it will work. And not addressing, well, what happens if everything becomes privatized, right? Not looking at kind of larger structural solutions. And I think that those conversations are uncomfortable. Like there's a reason that people want to focus on these quick fix, elegant, emancipatory solutions. They're exciting, they're sexy, they're something that you can put multiple people in a room and they'll agree on it, which again is really hard in America or anywhere, but certainly in our country. But I think that it's a much better, more robust, and actually exciting conversation to talk about what is the world that we really want to look like. Not just how do we throw money at everything to kind of help all of us stay afloat a little bit better, maybe, but like, what do we really want our society to look like? I think that's often framed as, oh, that's too hard of a conversation, or, there's so many different factors we would have to consider. But I think it's a much more exciting one, and also actually more realistic to have that conversation about what structural solutions would be, as opposed to just kicking the can down the road another 10 years, 20 years, et cetera.
That mayor in Stockton, like I said, I'm from the Bay Area.
Yeah.
So he was just the bee's knees for a little bit when that UBI rolled out. But they did receive private money from that, because that all didn't come from the city, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah. And so there's been a lot of UBI, universal basic income projects, happening literally all over the world, from Stockton to Kenya. And even in places like Sweden, which is, or I should say Scandinavia, which is interesting because they do have fairly robust
really nice social
services.
system.
Right. And so it's really interesting to look at in a place like Scandinavia, where there are robust public services, the money that someone receives through a UBI sort of program is actually invested in like things like private business, or like someone taking a year off to write a book, in a way that's not true in Stockton, because the money can be used for life as opposed to for getting by, right? And so again, the details of the background really matter. Often the kind of headline is universal basic income like helps people get by a little bit better, but like looking at the details of what it looks like in different places and what that money is being used for is really, really important. If you give someone $1,000 check and 800 of that has to go to childcare and 200 to healthcare, that's just like helping them pay for private services, not really helping them to have a dramatically different life.
And it's over in Stockton, if I'm not mistaken, because I know that guy didn't win again as mayor.
I think it was a like 2 or 3 year. I don't know the I'm not certainly not an expert on that. But yeah. Yeah. But it was important. It was important to look at it during COVID too, because that's when prices were going up, right? That's when prices of rent were going up, when prices of groceries were going up. And so it had a positive impact, but that impact was dampened by the fact that the price of basic services was getting more and more expensive.
Pascal, do you have anything to say in closing?
No, I appreciate the conversation.
I'd like to say I found your book incredibly readable.
Oh, thank you.
I am maybe 2/3 of the way through, and it's just been 2 days. I've done that in 2 days. I kind of couldn't put it down. I wish I'd have started earlier, then I'd have had it finished by now. Barack Obama's mom makes an appearance. That was
Yeah,
unexpected.
she does. She was a big microfinance advocate. Yeah.
That's what she was doing in Indonesia.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just learning about the history of microfinance and learning about the Cold War aspect of this, and what the United States was trying to export all over the world. I had no idea with my little Kiva loan that I was taking part in that.
You were
That's
part of the spread of neoliberal capitalism, Tucson.
it's well, they yanked the loan, so I wasn't.
Well, you know what Cat Williams said about you.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers is not like you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Well, yes, the book was excellent. It's it reminds me of the Non Giridharadas book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Winners Take All.
Winners Take All.
Winners Take All. It reminds me of the Vincent Bevins book. The
What
new
book
one,
is that?
If We Burn.
If We Burn, which
What
also
reminded you of If We Burn? Just the research that she did.
it details the 2010s.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, these are all like recent books, and the Cedric Johnson book.
I think a non-Girdados gets a bad rap because he's such a lib.
He wears cool leather jackets, though.
Sure. But I think because he's not like a quote unquote socialist, I think a lot of people look at him as the enemy. But that book is really important for understanding.
I think it's very well researched. He also has the connections to do it. He's sort of part of.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a McKinsey consultant too. That's how
Yeah.
he started out. Exactly.
I mean, he's kind of dropping the dime on why these people are not cool, and people are still looking at him like, "Oh, but you're not. You don't have the hammer and sickle in your profile."
Yeah. Yeah, as someone who worked in that space, like in kind of global aid, McKinsey has a huge outsized footprint in global aid, which we don't often talk about. Like it's not just here in the US. Like when I worked in Sierra Leone, they had basically a whole department in the Ministry of Health. And it is an incredibly accurate description of how private consultants work and the outsized impact that they have on public services or so-called public services. So whatever you think about him aside, it's really a very accurate description. And it's super important. I mean, it's like in the background of so much of what we do. And it's not like you're not often going to interact with a McKinsey consultant one-on-one, but you are with the work that they've done, right? It impacts our daily life in so many ways. So anyway, I highly recommend it.
Well, thank you so much.
Just also impacting our daily lives. The Clintons are also in this book. And I thought that would get Pascal's attention. Yeah, it's a very fascinating history, and I'm just very into this book. I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much. That's so nice to hear. I appreciate you reading it.
No, we appreciate you coming on here and taking the time to talk with us. Again, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there are links in the description to check out the book. It's got a long title. What's the title, Tucson?
Oh no, I don't have it right here.
It was so long, I kept forgetting it.
Did I just tell you?
No, we're gonna find it. Don't you dare!
Okay.
Don't you dare, Pascal. What's the title?
I don't have it in front of me.
Oh my God!
We are not yet able to live in the sky. The seductive promise of microfinance.
You know why this is a problem? Because I can't get I live in Mexico, and everything takes like extra days to get to me, so I can't even ask for a copy of a book anymore. The PDF.
Well, there's an audiobook version.
Oh, can't do audio.
Are you reading it?
Do you read it?
I don't read it. I had just had a baby when they were recording it, and I just figured I wasn't going to be up for it. So so they have another person who did it, who does a really amazing job.
Well, there you go. If you guys are into audiobooks, which a lot of people that watch this show are,
Mm-hmm.
I cannot do the audiobook thing.
Really?
I can't do it.
Oh,
Can't.
it really, yeah, you got to find the right narrator.
I need to highlight stuff.
Okay, fair enough. Fair
I
enough.
have to have I'm that guy because everything I read is for the show or something I have to write. I don't know how to enjoy myself with a book. That
Fair
Jason is dead. Thank you very much for your time and have a very nice evening.
Thank you so much.
Her name is Mara Kardas-Nelson. Her book is Ribbon in the Sky.
Oh, don't say that.
What is the book title?
We Are Not Yet Able to Live in the Sky, The Seductive Promise of Microfinance.
And the first line in the description, it just says, get Mara's book here. And there's a link that leads you right to the book. We are going to the champagne room. If you're a patron, there's a link that leads you right to the champagne room. Pascal, are you going to join us? Or are you going to dip out like you did last time?
Is there a link? Where's the link?
Oh, wow. You don't need it because I gave you access. So stop with the link. I don't have it stuff. Stop.
Where did you give me access?
Oh, just everybody's. You are
Does that
treating
mean I'm
me.
not allowed to give him the link?
I mean, you are treating me like the other woman right now.
Give me the link, Empress.
Can't believe this.
I'm not supposed to.
Don't treat me like the other woman. What do you mean? I didn't see your phone call. I didn't you know how it is. Horrible, man. Let's talk a little bit about Ta-Nehisi Coates in the champagne room.
Oh, let's not.
I mean, I don't want to talk about his hair or anything. I think the treatment he got was kind of shocking on Good Morning America. He looked so shocked. And then there's some other stuff we can go through. And Pascal was going to oil his chair. So thank you guys for hanging out. And we are
out.